Sudden hate is often a projection of a person's unclaimed shadow. It rarely emerges from logic, fairness, or genuine understanding. Instead, it rises from the deepest chambers of the psyche, those forgotten, suppressed, and denied territories that most people never dare to explore. Every human being carries a hidden side within them, a constellation of qualities, impulses, emotions, fears, and desires that they have disowned. This hidden aspect is known as the shadow, and when a person refuses to acknowledge it within themselves, they begin to see it everywhere else, especially in the people who trigger something they do not want to confront. When sudden hate appears, it behaves like an emotional lightning strike, fast, intense, seemingly unjustified. But beneath the surface lies a long, silent build-up of internal pressure. People harbor traits they dislike, tendencies they judge, and emotions they believe are unacceptable. Rather than face these elements, they push them down into the unconscious, imagining they have eliminated them. But the unconscious does not forget. It simply waits for a mirror, a reflection, a person whose presence activates the very qualities they buried. And when that mirror appears, hate becomes the easiest emotional reaction because it diverts attention outward instead of inward. The human mind is designed to protect its self-image. Most people want to believe they are kind, reasonable, moral, and self-aware. They want to see themselves as more evolved than they actually are. Facing the shadow threatens this idealized self-concept. Confronting it means acknowledging envy, insecurity, aggression, jealousy, laziness, resentment, or weakness, all the things one spends a lifetime hiding. When your behavior, confidence, choices, or growth unknowingly shine a light on those hidden qualities, some people feel exposed. And instead of turning inward, they turn against you. Sudden hate is rarely about the person receiving it. It is a psychological defense mechanism in the person expressing it. You may represent courage they lack, boundaries they avoid, authenticity they fear, or potential they suppress. Your existence becomes an emotional spotlight, revealing what they couldn't bear to see in themselves. This is why you can be kind, supportive, and genuine, yet still become the target of someone's unexplained dislike. You did not provoke their shadow, you simply illuminated it. Projection is the mind's attempt to externalize the internal. Instead of admitting I am angry, a person may say, you are threatening. Instead of recognizing I am insecure, they may believe, you make me feel inferior. Instead of acknowledging I am jealous, they may accuse you of arrogance. The mind flips the inner world outward to avoid pain. It assigns the qualities a person fears within themselves onto someone else. This allows them to maintain the illusion of purity while placing the darkness on an external figure. Sudden hate, therefore, becomes a psychological shortcut. It allows the person to avoid responsibility for their internal conflict by projecting it onto an unsuspecting target. Most people do not know they are projecting. The process is unconscious. They genuinely believe the negativity they feel is justified. They believe it originates from you, not from the unresolved parts of themselves. This is why rational explanation doesn't dissolve sudden hate. Logic cannot reach a territory governed by buried wounds and unacknowledged fears. The shadow operates beneath thinking, beneath awareness, beneath conscious control. People who have not integrated their shadow often fear in others what they repress in themselves. If they fear their own anger, they hate people who express strong boundaries. If they fear their own insecurities, they despise people who show confidence. If they fear their own potential, they resent people who grow. If they fear their own vulnerability, they attack those who speak honestly about their emotions. The shadow is a silent puppeteer, pulling emotional strings without the person realizing it. Sudden hate is a misdirected inner struggle. It is a battle someone is fighting within themselves, redirected toward an external figure who unintentionally evokes their hidden turmoil. The intensity of the reaction reflects the depth of their inner disconnection. The more a person suppresses their shadow, the more violently they react to anyone who mirrors it. Their hostility reveals not who you are, but what they refuse to acknowledge within their own psyche. Your growth forces others to face their own stagnation. It is one of the most uncomfortable truths of human psychology, yet it explains more silent resentment, sudden distance, and unexpected hostility than almost anything else. When you evolve, whether internally, emotionally, spiritually, financially, or in your sense of direction, you create an invisible contrast. Without intending to, you show others where they have remained the same. Growth is not only an expansion of self, it is a mirror that reveals the places others have refused to develop. Most people claim they want everyone around them to succeed, but this desire usually comes with an unspoken condition, as long as that success does not disrupt the equilibrium they are accustomed to. People get used to your old version. They get comfortable with who you were, with your habits, with your limits, with the role you played in their story. When that changes, the balance they depended on begins to shift. Your transformation creates psychological pressure, not because you harmed anyone, but because the mind compares by instinct. When your life moves forward, it naturally highlights where theirs has remained still. Growth is a kind of emotional spotlight. When someone watches you take responsibility for your life, it quietly exposes where they have avoided doing the same. When someone sees you building discipline, it reveals where they have been procrastinating. When someone observes you healing, it exposes where they have been suppressing. When someone witnesses you setting boundaries, it shines a light on where they have allowed themselves to be mistreated. The discomfort they feel isn't caused by your actions. It is caused by the contrast between your progress and their avoidance. Stagnation is rarely acknowledged openly. People rarely admit they feel stuck. Instead, they cloak stagnation under excuses, distractions, routines, and narratives that justify staying the same. But the psyche knows the truth. Deep inside, the part of them that longs for growth recognizes that they abandoned parts of themselves long ago. When someone close to them begins to grow, that dormant part awakens, but not always with inspiration. Sometimes it awakens with defensiveness, envy, or resentment, because your growth removes their ability to hide behind illusions. It is easier for someone to remain internally stagnant when everyone around them is also stagnant. Their habits feel normal. Their limitations feel acceptable. Their lack of evolution doesn't bother them because it blends into the environment. But the moment you change, you silently challenge everything they never challenged in themselves. It is not your achievements that provoke discomfort, it is the symbolic meaning of your achievements. You represent the possibility they turned away from, the courage they didn't choose, the discipline they avoided, the self-work they postponed. This is why people sometimes drift away when you improve your life. The distance is not random, it is self-protection. Being close to you requires them to face a reflection they are not ready to see. Your growth threatens their psychological equilibrium, not because you are superior, but because they are confronted with their own unrealized potential. And potential, when unfulfilled, becomes painful to witness. In relationships, friendships, and families, this dynamic is especially powerful. People anchor you to the role they first knew you in. They develop expectations, beliefs, and mental images of who you are. When you evolve beyond that image, they must either update their perception or resist the change. Many choose resistance. It feels safer to keep you in the box they built for you. Your transformation demands they adjust their internal world, and the human mind dislikes disruption. It prefers familiarity, even when that familiarity is limiting. Sometimes their reaction is subtle: withdrawal, avoidance, distancing, silence. Other times it becomes criticism, passive comments, or sudden hostility. The mind that feels threatened finds ways to re-establish balance, and one of the simplest ways is to diminish the source of discomfort. If they can convince themselves that your growth is arrogance, luck, or hypocrisy, they no longer have to confront the real issue, their own stagnation. Your growth does not create insecurity in others. It reveals the insecurity that was already there. It exposes the gap between who they are and who they could be. It reveals the dreams they postponed, the decisions they avoided, and the fears they never confronted. For some, this becomes motivation. For others, it becomes discomfort. And discomfort, when unexamined, often turns into resentment. Growth disrupts shared patterns. It changes conversations, priorities, values, and rhythms. This disruption forces others to either rise with you or remain where they are. Many will resist rising because growth requires effort, honesty, and self-confrontation. Stagnation requires nothing. So instead of choosing growth, they choose judgment, distance, or denial. People resent what mirrors their unlived potential. Few psychological forces are as powerful or as deeply rooted as this one. When people encounter someone who reflects the life they could have lived but didn't, they experience a silent emotional fracture. It is not jealousy in the superficial sense. It's a far deeper discomfort. The confrontation with all the choices they avoided, the courage they never exercised, the dreams they abandoned, and the parts of themselves they never allowed to fully develop. Resentment is not toward you as a person, it is toward what your presence symbolizes. Every human being carries within them an inner blueprint, an intuitive sense of what they are capable of becoming. This blueprint is not always conscious, but it exists as a quiet knowing, a subtle ache, a recognition of their own potential. When they see someone growing, creating, or stepping into their purpose, it activates that blueprint. But instead of feeling inspired, many feel exposed. They are confronted with the gap between who they are and who they could have been. This gap is painful because it reveals the consequences of their avoided fears, postponed decisions, and abandoned possibilities. Most people construct narratives to make peace with the parts of themselves they have neglected. They tell themselves they are not ready, not qualified, not privileged enough, not supported enough. They convince themselves that timing is wrong, resources are scarce, or the world is stacked against them. These stories soften the discomfort of unrealized potential. But the moment they encounter someone who has refused those excuses, someone who has embraced growth despite obstacles, someone who chooses to move instead of rationalize, their narratives crumble. The life you are building challenges the story they tell themselves about why they cannot build their own. Resentment forms in the space where self-confrontation is too painful to face. When someone sees you acting on your dreams, they remember the dreams they let die. When they see you disciplined, they remember their own procrastination. When they see you setting boundaries, they remember their own inability to speak up. When they see you healing, they remember their own emotional avoidance. Your presence becomes a mirror that reflects not only who they are, but who they were capable of becoming. This dynamic is especially strong among people who know you personally. Friends, family members, co-workers, even acquaintances. Strangers may admire you, but those close to you measure themselves against the same starting point. They saw you at the beginning. They know your history, your struggles, your mistakes. When you rise, it disrupts their internal hierarchy. It forces them to question why you move forward while they remain still. The familiarity makes the comparison unavoidable, and comparison, when it exposes stagnation, often transforms into resentment. Resentment thrives where there is unexpressed potential. People project their disappointment onto the person who represents what they could have achieved. Instead of acknowledging the pain of their unfulfilled aspirations, they direct that discomfort outward. It feels easier to resent someone else's progress than to take responsibility for their own lack of movement. It is psychologically safer to criticize the mirror than to face what the reflection reveals. What they resent is not your achievements, it is the reminder of their own abandoned identity. They see in you the courage they didn't choose, the risks they refused to take, the discipline they didn't cultivate, and the authenticity they never embodied. They see the version of themselves they could have become if they had shown up for their own life with the same level of commitment. And because the mind seeks equilibrium, it attempts to reduce this discomfort by lowering the value of what it cannot embody. Resentment becomes a coping mechanism. Sometimes the resentment is subtle, a change in tone, passive remarks, distancing, small criticisms disguised as concern. Other times it is more visible, undermining your efforts, minimizing your accomplishments, or interpreting your growth as a threat. These responses are rarely conscious. The person is not aware that they are reacting to their own potential. They genuinely believe the discomfort is caused by something external, something about you, something you did. But internally, the emotional trigger is the reminder of who they chose not to become. Unlived potential does not disappear. It becomes a silent presence within the psyche, a kind of emotional residue that accumulates over time. Every time someone witnesses a reflection of that unlived life in another person, the residue is stirred. The emotions that arise, envy, irritation, judgment, resentment, are not rooted in hatred or personal dislike. They are rooted in grief for the life they never stepped into, grief that has no language, grief that is easier to misdirect than to acknowledge. Sudden hate emerges when your authenticity disrupts the collective mask. Human beings rarely operate as individuals. Most interact as members of an unspoken psychological group. Every social circle, family system, workplace, or community has an invisible set of rules. Rules about how to behave, how to speak, how much to express, how much to hide, and which truths must remain unspoken. These rules form what can be called a collective mask, a shared illusion maintained to avoid discomfort, confrontation, or the need for inner growth. As long as everyone plays along, harmony appears to exist. But the moment someone begins living authentically, the delicate equilibrium fractures, revealing the tensions the mask was designed to suppress. Authenticity has a disruptive quality because it exposes what others pretend not to see. When you begin to speak more honestly, you challenge the unspoken agreement to keep certain truths buried. When you set boundaries, you question the expectation that people should tolerate what drains them. When you grow, you reveal the comfort zones others cling to. When you express yourself fully, you highlight the parts others have silenced within themselves. Authenticity shines a light on the very illusions people depend on to maintain their self-image and their place within the group, and that light can feel threatening. Most people do not consciously choose inauthenticity. They adapt to their environment early in life, learning which behaviors earn acceptance and which lead to rejection. Over time, they build an identity shaped more by survival needs than by truth. This identity becomes a mask, a version of themselves designed to fit in rather than to express who they really are. When someone around them stops performing and begins to live with more honesty and self-alignment, it disrupts the familiar system. It introduces unpredictability. It challenges roles. It exposes the artificiality of behaviors everyone silently agreed to maintain. This disruption can trigger sudden hate, not because the authentic person has done harm, but because they have broken the invisible contract. They refuse to play the role assigned to them. They stop participating in the emotional economy that keeps the group comfortable. They introduce a new standard of truthfulness that others are not ready to embrace. And when people feel their mask is being threatened, they often respond with hostility toward the one who revealed the cracks. The collective mask acts as a psychological shield. It protects people from confronting their own contradictions, suppressed desires, unresolved wounds, and unacknowledged insecurities. It allows them to maintain an identity that may be fragile but feels safe. Authenticity, on the other hand, demands self-awareness. It demands alignment between inner values and outer actions. For someone deeply attached to their mask, witnessing such alignment can be deeply unsettling. It forces a confrontation with the dissonance they carry, the gap between who they are and who they pretend to be. Most groups rely on predictability. Everyone is expected to behave in ways that maintain emotional balance. The moment someone changes, it disrupts this balance. If you stop pleasing others, you disrupt the role of the caretaker. If you stop shrinking, you disrupt the role of the quiet one. If you stop tolerating disrespect, you disrupt the role of the compliant one. The disruption creates anxiety in those who needed you to stay the same in order to avoid examining themselves. And when people feel psychologically destabilized, they often mask their discomfort with irritation, criticism, or sudden hostility. Authenticity is also contagious. When one person shows up as their true self, It sends an unconscious signal to others that they too could be more honest, more expressive, more courageous. But instead of feeling empowered, many feel pressured. They feel exposed. They sense that if one person can break the rules were never real to begin with. This realization threatens the foundation of the shared illusion they depend on. It becomes easier to attack the person who broke the pattern than to question why the pattern existed in the first place. Sudden hate often arises because people interpret authenticity as rebellion. They view it as a betrayal of the collective identity. It feels like someone is refusing to participate in a performance that everyone else is still trapped in. The authentic person becomes a reminder of the freedom others have denied themselves. And freedom, when witnessed by someone who feels psychologically confined, often becomes a source of resentment. The collective mask also functions as a form of emotional camouflage. It hides insecurity, fear, inadequacy, and the need for validation. When you begin showing up without that camouflage, you reveal what others are trying to hide, even if unintentionally. Your honesty highlights their avoidance. Your clarity highlights their confusion. Your growth highlights their stagnation. The discomfort they feel is not about you. It is about what your authenticity awakens within their own internal world. In essence, sudden hate is often a mind's attempt to protect an outdated identity. When your authenticity challenges that identity, people react not from wisdom but from fear. Hate is a defense mechanism of the fragile ego. It is not born from strength, clarity, or genuine understanding. It arises from a part of the psyche that feels threatened, exposed, or destabilized. The ego, especially when fragile, does not tolerate disruption. It wants to maintain control, certainty, and superiority. When these are challenged, even subtly, hate becomes one of its quickest and most instinctive protective responses. The person expressing hate often believes they are reacting logically, but in reality, they are defending a delicate psychological structure that feels endangered. The fragile ego fears anything that undermines its illusion of power. It thrives on the belief that it is right, important, justified, and secure. When someone else's behavior, growth, or confidence contradicts this sense of superiority, the ego experiences a kind of internal collapse. It cannot accept responsibility, admit insecurity, or acknowledge mistakes, so it shifts blame outward. Hate becomes a psychological shield, allowing the person to disown the uncomfortable emotions rising within them. A fragile ego cannot tolerate ambiguity. It needs simple explanations: heroes and enemies, right and wrong, superiority and inferiority. When reality becomes too complex, when someone contradicts their worldview, or when they feel they are losing psychological ground, hate simplifies the narrative. It reduces the discomfort into a single target. It says you are the problem, instead of allowing the person to see the deeper truth that they are confronting their own inadequacy, fear, or self-doubt. Hate is also a diversion. It redirects attention away from the internal world. Instead of acknowledging vulnerability, the person projects it outward. They attack instead of reflect. They criticize instead of question. They judge instead of understand. This diversion is not conscious, it happens automatically. The ego instinctively pushes out what it cannot handle internally. Hate, in this sense, becomes a survival instinct of the unexamined self. When someone feels insecure, powerless, or inferior, hate gives them a temporary illusion of strength. It creates a false sense of elevation. By devaluing someone else, the ego momentarily feels superior. This psychological elevation is fragile and fleeting, but it provides immediate relief. The ego uses hate to avoid confronting the deeper wound beneath it. The intensity of hate often reflects the depth of the wound. The more fragile the ego, the stronger its reaction to perceived threats. Hate also arises when the ego feels unseen or invalidated. If someone does not receive the attention, respect, or admiration they believe they deserve, they may interpret it as a personal attack. The fragile ego cannot see beyond itself. It expects others to reinforce its sense of importance. When that reinforcement is missing, it experiences rejection. Hate then becomes a way to restore a feeling of dominance. If you do not value me, I will make you the enemy. Another function of hate is to maintain narrative control. The fragile ego depends on stories about itself, stories of superiority, innocence, righteousness, or victimhood. When someone challenges these stories directly or indirectly, the ego begins to crumble. Hate allows the person to preserve their internal narrative by making the other person wrong. If they can portray someone else as the villain, they avoid revising the story they tell themselves about who they are. Many people do not recognize that their hate is actually fear. Fear of inadequacy, fear of being exposed, fear of losing control, fear of confronting parts of themselves they would rather ignore. The fragile ego is built on avoidance. It avoids responsibility, self-reflection, and humility. Hate provides a way to keep those avoided territories sealed off. It creates noise to drown out vulnerability. Relationships and social dynamics often reveal this mechanism. In families, friendships, and workplaces, hate can emerge when someone sets boundaries, grows, or changes. The fragile ego interprets change as threat. It does not adapt, it defends. It reacts strongly when someone steps outside the role it assigned them. Hate becomes a way to enforce the old pattern, to push the person back into place, to preserve the structure in which the fragile ego feels safe. In many cases, the person expressing hate is not aware of their fragility. They may appear confident, dominant, or self-assured, but the intensity of their reaction reveals the truth. Strength does not require hostility. Confidence does not require devaluation. A stable ego does not need to attack. Only a fragile one does, because it senses that its internal world is too delicate to withstand discomfort or self-confrontation. The ego uses hate as armor, but that armor is thin. It cracks whenever reality contradicts its illusions. It reacts aggressively because it cannot tolerate the idea that someone else's presence, choices, or authenticity might expose its weaknesses. The hate itself becomes proof of its fragility, even though the person expressing it does not see this connection.